Which watercolour brushes do I need? This is probably a question that we've all asked ourselves. So here are 10 brushes that I think are the most important ones to have within your kit. Hi, my name is Paul Hopkinson and I like teaching here on YouTube and also on my website where I complete projects from the start all the way through to the finish within my online school. Take a peek in the link in the description down below. Now the first one I'm going to show you today is my mop brush. Now this is one made from squirrel hair, but you can get some nice synthetic ones on the market as well. And there's some lovely soft brushes out there, but it needs to be soft. And I use this for applying water very quickly onto the paper. Because you can see here that the water spreads really quickly with a large brush. And this is a round-ended brush as well, so there's no fine tip on this. It holds a lot of water, so that allows you to work, again, quickly without lots of reloading that brush. You can still work around a fairly slim line for masking fluid at the same time. But as I mentioned, you can get synthetic versions as well, which are just as soft. And as you can see from this picture here, is that it's nice and wet. Even the paper is all kind of cockled up, which you expect to happen when you're working with a wet and wet technique. Now a size 18 brush is another brush which I use, and it's quite a large brush for me as well, it really is. But this one is a synthetic brush and there's a variety of different brushes on the market. But this is a good way also of applying wet and wet washes on a very large sheet of paper. So if you're working on a large background like this one for this collared dove, then you find that you can cover a lot of ground very swiftly indeed. But you can also see that you can spread that paint around quite well with the size brush. And even though it's synthetic, it does seem to hold quite a lot of paint as well. So it's very useful for that method. So what you can also do, if you haven't got a size 18, you can substitute this with a size like a 1/4 inch mop brush, or any mop brush really, a soft bristle brush will do. And you find with this sort of brush as well is that you can spread the paint out quite well. There's a lot of spring in the bristles rather than if we had a sable brush for example where the spring isn't quite as good as this. Or in other words, the spring back or the snap back rate. That's not easy to say, you know. But you know, it doesn't have to be expensive to brush either. My brush here is just an old worn tip brush, so it hasn't even got much of a point on it anymore. So I can still use this for applying large background washes. And also the beauty about using a large brush for something like this is that because you can cover the paper fairly quickly, there's less chance of it drying in between while you're working on it, which can be an issue when you want a nice kind of wet and wet blurred effect. Now sizes 4, 5 or 6 on the brush sizes. Good size to work with. You can actually achieve quite a lot of detail with this size brush as well. So it depends on the quality of the brush, depends on how fine that tip is. You find you can still apply reasonable washes with this size brush, but obviously not for such a large area than we can with a size 18 or mop brush. But you find also you can actually work with a greater control with this as well. So you can work on more sort of specific areas compared to those larger brushes. So even though I'm applying this wash on the seal's head, using this kind of smaller size compared to the size 18, you can see you can still control that. You can still move that paint around. But the beauty about working with this is that you've got a better tip on that brush as well. So you can just be a little bit more fine-tuned when you're working with a wet and wet background or even a little bit of detail. I also find as well you don't have to spend a fortune on these, so they can be quite reasonably priced as well. And I think that's also due to the fact that there's less hairs, less bristles, less filaments, depends on what type of brush you buy, so therefore that makes that brush that little bit cheaper. And I tend to use brushes of this size more for the sort of earlier layers of the work I do, before I start thinking about any detail. Another tip when using one of these brushes is that you can use it for softening down some of the previous applied detailed layers. So when I work with my fine tip brush, my really small brushes, then I know that I can come back in with this brush just slightly dampened, just to soften down that detail layer just a little bit. So a very handy brush to have. Also don't forget to click on that subscribe button down below and don't forget that bell icon as well, just so you'll never miss one of my YouTube videos. Now size 1 or 2. So these are some of the brushes for those very fine details. Not really fine because I use a size 00 for that. And a lot of artists just use something as small as a 2 or even a smaller one, which is obviously a size 1. That also depends on how well that you look after your brushes. And I store my brushes upright with the tip pointing down, just so that any water drains out of those bristles when you're not using that brush. So when you look at the tip of this brush, look how fine that tip is, look how pointy it is. And with that little fine point, you can create some very small details, some very fine lines. Depending, of course, how much paint you put on that brush to begin with. The less paint you use on your brush, the finer the details will be with a brush of this size. And sometimes you can use one of these, let's say for the whole entire painting, if you really wanted to. Especially when that brush is new and there's no wear and tear to that tip. It starts to round after a little bit of time, doesn't it? So when you look at this tip, you can see how fine this one is because it is a relatively new brush. And you can actually see on this deer painting I'm working on that you can get some very fine lines indeed for this. So it's really good for applying a wash to a small area as well because they can hold a lot of water. Well, a bit more water than a size 00, of course, which is even smaller. So something like a size 1 or 2 is economical and also quite versatile as well. Well worth having within your painting kit. Now our next brush is also my favourite brush, the size 00. Now this one is a Cotman Series 111 and it's a synthetic brush, so it's not sable or anything like that. I find these brushes have got a kind of nice snap rate to them. So all that means is, when you lift your brush off the paper, it will kind of come back to a point really quickly. So it kind of maintains that shape basically. But you can see the detail when I'm working on this hummingbird here. The detail you can gradually build up with such a fine tip. Yes, it means you've got to keep reloading that brush on a regular basis. So you need to have your palette very close to hand as well when you're working on it. But it enables you to kind of work on layers step by step and working through a variety of layers using the finest of marks. You can even go smaller than this, I know, down size 40, size 10-0, and lots of very tiny brushes. But this is as small as I tend to go. But as I mentioned, it's got a very fine tip which allows that really tiny detail, so you can be very precise within your paintings. So for example, when I'm working on this dog portrait, you can see that I'm actually keeping the brush fairly dry. So that means the lines break up as I apply that paint. So even with a fine size 00 brush, you can still use a variety of techniques along the way, from dry brush to stippling to obviously extremely fine lines. Now this is one of my favourite brushes, and it's a homemade brush which I call the Replicator brush. And I use this for applying lots and lots of lines in one go. This is actually very similar to one of those kind of bought rake or comb brushes you can buy. But this one is more personal really, because every time you make one of these, then you find that each one's unique, each one's completely individual, which is really handy. See what I do, I've got a little video on how to make one of these here on YouTube, so I'll pop a little link for you in the top right hand corner right now. Now when I'm working on animal portraits, I very often use this for larger portraits. So when it's going to be for lots of fur or lots of feathers, for example. But I don't use it for those initial layers, you know. So if I'm working on maybe 2, 3 or 4 layers of detail, probably even more sometimes, I use this for the first 1, 2 or even sometimes 3 layers. Depends on how many top layers I'm going to put over the top of that. And that's because when you're working with the lines on something like this, you can see that the lines are quite parallel to one another, aren't they? So they're too much in line. You don't want the animal looking as if it's, well, been combed. It's been to the barbers. So you've got to be careful with that. So when I'm working on this fox here, it's going to start to kind of build up that detail which you need. Because every layer of the detail that we apply will gradually get deeper and deeper and thicker in the way it feels as well. So this is really useful to kind of get lots and lots of lines on in one go. So giving yourself time to kind of make one out of a very, very old brush, one of the brushes that you're literally going to throw in the bin, is really useful for kind of having to play with that idea. So why don't you give a go making one of these for yourself and see how you get on with working with my homemade Replicator brush. Now one of my kind of very old unassuming brushes which I use mainly for mixing with. Now this is an old brush I've had for many years, and the tip has well and truly worn away, and I find it ideal for when I'm trying to kind of get that paint out of those half pans, which as we know can be quite hard in some cases, especially when you're working on those half pans first of all. The worst thing you want to do is use your decent quality fine tip brushes to work up that pigment within those half pan blocks, because you find that you soon wear those tips away. So using an old stiff bristled brush like this one here for example, which I used to use for acrylic painting years ago, is ideal for kind of working up that colour and mixing those colours within your mixing palette. But I also use it for testing with as well, because I find that the bristles are still soft enough to kind of work for testing your colours out. So by using scrap pieces of watercolour paper and using this old brush, it just saves the wear and tear on your decent quality brushes which you want to use solely for painting with. Masking fluid. I know, a brush for masking fluid. I very often use a brush, and this is one of my old size 00 brushes. So you know when you got a brush that's kind of worn away and it hasn't got much of a tip left on it and the bristles are kind of spanned apart like a big fan brush, and you think, okay, time for that one to go in the bin. Don't throw them away. These are really useful for saving for applying masking fluid. And then you could use even a cocktail stick like this one here, working on this ear of this pine marten, to kind of add some fine lines. And that's because I want to add a background on this painting and I want them really fine details to show through. And you'll also find that when you use an old size 00 brush for masking fluid, it enables you to kind of flick hairs out as well, nearly as finely as a cocktail stick. So masking fluid brushes, you can't just use a brush, you can also use, as I say, other items as well. But you've got to think about when you're working with masking fluid brushes, it soon clogs them bristles up. You can use an old bar of soap and drag a damp, clean brush through the old bar of soap a few times first of all. Kind of charge up those bristles with soap suds. Not too wet though. Then you can go to your masking fluid and start applying it. That will help kind of preserve those bristles a little bit longer. But eventually you find that the masking fluid will kind of work its way into that metal ferrule on your brush. And in turn, your bristles will just go into a very funny looking shape. But I'll tell you what, save it, because that's very useful for making little different marks and techniques for applying masking fluid as well. Never throw those old brushes away. Lifting off brush. Now this is another one of my homemade brushes. I know, look at this one. Now what I've done with this one, I've kind of crushed the end of it first of all with a pair of pliers. But I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll pop a little link to the top right hand corner for you again on how I made this particular brush. Have a look at that one after you've played this video. Now what you need for something like this, you need a stiff bristle brush. And what I've done with this, I've got a craft knife and just kind of marked out and cut around it so I've got a nice little kind of chiseled edge point around the top of it. But working with a stiff bristled brush is better, I find, because it will pull more paint off. But you still got to be careful not to damage that paper. So when I'm working on the edge of this lovely Devon Violet flower, I want to lift off a small amount of paint, just kind of highlight the edge of each petal. I'm using this kind of chiseled edge, as you can see, to do this. I'm just dampening this brush down once, but not soaking wet. I don't want to flood the paper with lots and lots of water. You find also something like this will be better at scrubbing the paper rather than just very lightly going over the top. Depends how much paint you want to take off the paper first. So remember, don't overload it with water. Take your time. Test it out on some scrap watercolour paper first of all with some paint already on it, just so you know how it's going to perform before you even go to any detailed painting that you're working on, and then give it a go. But as you can see, it's a very handy brush to have within your painting kit, and one which I use quite a lot. For my final brush, I'm going to use my stippling brush. So this is an old oil painting brush, so a very stiff bristled brush, that's all it is. And I use this for adding those finer details, or very fine kind of dotty effects onto this woodwork on this bare cut painting I'm working on. So I can load this brush up with nearly dry paint, and then I can use this brush like this to add the very finest marks onto the paper. So when I'm working on this woodwork to add extra texture onto the wood, we can use this technique for that, just kind of work around the wood effects. So let me just show you what I mean. So the idea behind this is that I can really add those finest of marks, but remember, don't overload the brush. By overloading it, you just get blur effects all the time. And the more marks that you add closer together, the finer the details will look as well. So by loading this brush up with nearly dry paint, and I mean nearly dry, don't have it too wet, then you can use this to add those finest of marks. I also like to test this out first of all as well, so it's not too overloaded, so at least you can get some general idea before you go to your main painting. So when you stipple with this, try and keep the bristles more upright, okay? So more of a vertical level brush. This way that when you apply the pressure onto the paper, the dots will be just little dots and not elongated dots. Got the idea? And as you build up these marks, the more detail you create, of course, but you also start to create form and shape. So add more dots in one side, so kind of concentrate the effects more on one side of the area than the other, to get more of a curved feel to whatever you're working on. And in this case, as you can see, it's more for the kind of bark texture for this bear cub. But also you find that the bristles tend not to bend as much, do they, when you're working with something more of a kind of stiffer feel to it. You try doing this with a softer feel brush, such as a watercolour brush, you won't get the same effects. So when you go into those discount shops and you see these oil painting or acrylic painting brushes on the shelf for £1 or whatever it might be, buy them. They're very handy for working with effects, such as, well, stippling of course. Now, do you have a favourite watercolour brush that you wouldn't be without? Leave me a comment down below, I'd be interested to know. Now, if you'd like to make 5 unique brushes from 5 brushes that cost just 10 pence each, head to the video to the right and I'll show you how. I'll see you there.